I just had a useful meeting with Minister Lavrov. That's part of my regular contacts with him and part of the political dialogue between NATO and Russia. I think it's useful to meet Minister Lavrov. I meet him regularly on the margins of the Munich Security Conference and also on the margins of the UN General Assembly and also on other occasions. We discussed mainly Ukraine and risk reduction, transparency, and the future of the political dialogue between NATO and Russia. And since for 2 years, from the summer of 2014 to the summer of 2016, there were no meetings in the NATO-Russia Council. But since then, we have had 6 meetings, and this is not the easy dialogue, but that's exactly why it is important. Because I believe that political contacts, political dialogue is especially important when the situation is difficult as it is now. But during the meeting today, we addressed Ukraine and I underlined the importance of the implementation of the Minsk agreements. We also, I also said that the situation in Ukraine is the main reason for the deterioration of the relationship between NATO and Russia, and also the main reason why NATO has adopted its military posture in the eastern part of the alliance. We also touched upon the proposals to have UN forces in Ukraine to make sure that the Minsk agreements are fully implemented. This is an issue I also expect to discuss with President Poroshenko when I meet him later on. And I also discussed it with Secretary General Antonio Guterres yesterday. So far, I haven't seen much movement on that or much progress on that proposal, but at least it is a proposal which I think it is important that we all look into because we need some more progress on implementing the Minsk agreements. Then we addressed risk reduction, transparency, and I welcome the fact that we in the NATO-Russia Council have been able to have reciprocal briefings on military posture, on military exercises, and we are ready to continue with that, to brief, for instance, on the NATO exercise Trident Juncture, which will take place in Norway this fall, and continue to have reciprocal briefings on exercises and military posture. We also, or I also underlined the importance of military lines of communications and contacts between our commanders, General Gerasimov and SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. So I think that was, in a way, the main issues we touched upon. And we agreed then to continue to work for a new meeting on the NATO-Russia Council. No date is fixed, and we have to work on the date and the agenda, but at least there is a support for new meetings of the NATO-Russia Council.
Sorry, on the UN peacekeeper idea, did you get any sense from Minister Lavrov that he might be open to what the West is proposing, which is actually a proper full-blown force? And I think what President Putin initially proposed was just a UN force to protect the OSCE. And I wondered also if a quick reaction on Prime Minister May's suggestion for a security treaty between Britain and the EU. wondered if, with NATO at its heart, I wondered if you thought that sounded like a good idea.
I haven't been able to see the concrete, also the text or the what she in detail what she proposed. But I think the idea of having a close cooperation between the UK and the EU after Brexit, also on defence and security issues, is important and something I welcome. Especially since she underlined so clearly that NATO is, what should I say, the main or is responsible for collective defense in Europe and has to be built around and support the efforts of NATO. This is the same message as I have on European defense efforts or EU defense efforts, that we welcome those efforts. But as the European leaders themselves have underlined again and again, this is not an alternative to NATO. This is something that must complement NATO. I met with Mark Rutte, the Dutch Prime Minister, earlier this morning, and that was exactly also his message. Is he welcomes, of course, EU efforts on defense, but not as an alternative, but something that can strengthen the European pillar within NATO. And having a close relationship between the UK and the EU after Brexit will, in a way, just add to that. Then on Ukraine, well, I think it's too early to say what kind of possible solution that can be agreed or reached when it comes to UN presence in Ukraine. And since I discussed this, or since this proposal put on the table at least many months ago, not much progress has been achieved. So it remains to be seen whether it's possible. But I think it's important to continue to work on different proposals to make sure that we try to have some progress on the implementation of the Minsk agreements.
The Norwegian women's team was 4 seconds behind the Russians. Did you discuss that with the foreign minister, and did he razz you? And secondly, if I could burrow down in Ukraine a little bit more, Ambassador Volker of the United States had put on this table this idea of a phased approach, and maybe that the compromise between the two visions of peacekeeping could be bridged a little bit by implementing the peacekeepers over time, and then maybe making some of the political measures that the Russians have been demanding the Ukrainians do. Is there, I don't know how detailed you got with Minister Lavrov on this, but is there sort of, do you see a compromise here within this sort of, the idea of a phased approach in the peacekeeping?
So I met with Volker a couple of weeks ago, and we then discussed, of course, his efforts to try to make progress on the implementation of the Minsk agreements, and then we also discussed different proposals, including these proposals to have UN forces there. A phased approach is one way of trying to reach an agreement. I have an open mind. I think we all should have an open mind to different ways to overcome the obstacles and then start to make progress. So that's one way of trying to achieve that.
Broadcasting company Wiley, and there has been this new report ordered by Mr. Rasmussen about this peacekeeping operation, and he emphasized as countries which are not members of NATO, like Finland and Sweden, could take a big role in this operation. Was this proposal discussed with Mr. Lavrov? And how do you say, do you think Russia could be more open to peacekeepers from non-NATO countries than?
We discussed the proposal to have UN peacekeepers in Ukraine, and my message has been over a long period of time that I think that peacekeepers must have the responsibility to also not only be, as I say, responsible for the OSCE monitors, but be responsible for the whole region, including making the border between Russia and Ukraine a border which is also accessible and which is part of what they then have the responsibility for. We didn't discuss which nations that could participate in such a UN force, but it goes in a way without saying that a UN force can include, of course, many other countries than NATO countries, and therefore, I think the idea to have a UN force may be a way to see some progress on the implementation.
At some point that he wouldn't accept, that Russia wouldn't accept any NATO.
First of all, I will not go into all the details in exactly what we discussed, but UN is much more than NATO. So that's the reason why I think a UN, also that at least that's NATO is 29 allies. The UN is the whole world, and of course the UN force can be much broader than only NATO countries. But first, I think we have to make more progress on the whole concept of a UN force before we start to discuss exactly which nations are going to be part of a potential UN force.
Okay, gentleman on the right.
Yeah, Time Magazine, thanks for doing the briefing. I wanted to ask, I'm sure you saw yesterday the developments in the Special Counsel's investigation with the new indictments against Russia. Did that come up in terms of the propaganda war, the alleged hybrid war that Russia is waging, again, allegedly against the U.S. And other NATO allies? Did you bring that up? Do you bring that up with Minister Lavrov? And what are his responses to those kinds of messages?
The indictment is part of a U.S. domestic legal process, and I think it's important that this is something which is handled as a domestic, as a legal process in the United States. What I can say in general is that we have seen reports from many countries about interference in democratic processes, and that's something that NATO allies are very much aware of. We have to be able to counter misinformation. We have to be able to counter attempts to interfere in domestic political processes. And just by raising awareness of the risks of that kind of interferences, I think we are responding. We need also to be aware of how social media can be used, and we need to protect our cyber networks. And this is something that NATO is working on now with more exercises. We are stepping up the efforts to protect our own cyber networks, but also to help allies to protect their cyber networks. We just conducted a big exercise, one of the biggest in the world, on cyber. And we also provide facts when we see disinformation against NATO allies or our forces and NATO operations. Let me also highlight the importance of free and independent media to be able to check facts, to ask the difficult questions, to check the sources. Free and independent media has always been an important part of our democratic open societies, but perhaps even more important now, because there are so many forces that try to misuse and to undermine the open and transparent societies by different kinds of disinformation and interference activities.
But that doesn't come up in bilateral meetings with Lavrov, for example. It's not on the agenda.
Again, I will be careful being too specific, so I will not say more about that.
Thank you. Secretary General, it's about your meeting with President Poroshenko. You already mentioned that you will discuss peacekeeping operation. What else at the agenda? Do you attempt to discuss Hungarian blocking NATO-Ukraine Commission at the ministerial level, and how it will project to, for example, on NATO summit? Can we expect, at least at that level, NATO-Ukraine Commission? Thank you.
So first of all, I think it's a bit too early to say exactly what we are going to discuss. I meet President Poroshenko very often. We speak on phone, we meet at different occasions. So I have already spoken with him recently, also addressing this issue of the language law. But I guess that will be also an issue we will address during our meeting later on today. In general, the meetings I have with President Poroshenko, we discuss the political and practical support NATO and NATO allies are providing to Ukraine. We will continue to do so. We will discuss efforts to find ways to implement the Minsk agreements, including the UN, to have UN forces. And then, as I said, I also expect that the language law will be addressed.
DPA. Secretary General, a quick question on the NATO-Russia Council. Do you see any chance to convene the next meeting before the elections in Russia? And the second question, if I may, did Mr. Lavrov announce you name who will be the next ambassador, Russian ambassador to NATO, and when will he arrive in Brussels?
We didn't discuss any dates, and that's not dates has not been things we have discussed at that between me and Minister Lavrov before either. So that's something our staffs look into and find the exact date for the NATO-Russia Council meeting. But he expressed and I expressed a willingness to convene a new meeting. Then we have to find a date, and we need to agree on which items we will address. So therefore, I'm not able to say anything about the dates. The next ambassador. Well, it's a normal thing that after some years there is a change of ambassadors, and I think Alexander Grushko has been there for several years already, so it's not very strange that he is going to be replaced, but sometimes it takes some time before from one ambassador is also leaves and then the other ambassador is appointed, and that's the case now. So they didn't give any dates about when a new ambassador will be appointed. In the meantime, we do as we always do when there are no ambassador, and that is that we work with a mission in Brussels. There is one in charge there, and we also work directly with Moscow. For instance, my Deputy Secretary General, Rose Gottmuller, she engaged also directly with the people in the ministry in Moscow.
Hi, Felix TV from Hong Kong, and my question will be, is there any meeting planned with NATO from the Chinese delegation here? And also, can you shed some lights on the current situation with NATO and the bilateral relationship with NATO and China, and maybe possibly what the situation will be next year?
I haven't any meetings with the Chinese representatives here at the Munich Security Conference. I'm not aware of whether other people in my delegation will meet someone from China. But I met recently with a new Chinese ambassador to NATO at the NATO headquarters. That was a very useful meeting. I recognize the growing and important role China is playing in world politics, and also the importance of working with China addressing some regional challenges, like for instance Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a neighbor, China is a neighbor of Afghanistan, and NATO, we have our biggest military operation takes place in Afghanistan, and I know that President Ghani and the Afghan government are reaching out to China also to try to build regional support for a political solution. So there are different issues where China and NATO, as I say, are addressing the same challenges. Afghanistan is one. Proliferation of nuclear weapons, North Korea. I welcome that China has supported stronger economic sanctions in the UN Security Council to put pressure on North Korea to stop their nuclear program and stop violating UN security resolutions. So in different areas, NATO and China are addressing the same challenges, and I welcome also then closer contacts between China and NATO.
Sabine Hackner, ARD Radio. Secretary General, yesterday you mentioned that the US is convinced that Russia is violating the INF Treaty. And you demand transparency. Are you convinced too of the violation, and what's about the European NATO partners?
This is the INF Treaty is a treaty that was signed between United States and at that time the Soviet Union. So NATO is not part of the treaty. But of course it is a treaty which is of great importance for all NATO allies because the deployment of intermediate range missiles in Russia and the deployment of intermediate range nuclear missiles in NATO countries in Europe in the 80s was of great concern for both publics and politicians, and it was really a big issue, not least in Germany. Therefore, we very much support the INF Treaty, which abolished a whole category of weapons. All intermediate land-based weapons were abolished by that treaty. And therefore, it is of great concern for all allies, the reports about violations of the INF Treaty. And all allies call on Russia to, in a transparent and verifiable way, comply with the treaty. But it is the US which is part, so it's the US that has determined the violation. We call on Russia to be transparent on the compliance with the treaty. And what the US has reported is that Russia has developed and flight tested a new intermediate range cruise missile, which is then in violation of the INF Treaty.
In the speech yesterday, you talked about the INF Treaty and how the nuclear threat is back on the agenda. Is this something you discussed with Lavrov today?
That was not among the main issues in my discussion. We have clearly conveyed to the Russians at several occasions the importance of respecting existing agreements, both nuclear agreements but also conventional agreements, respecting the INF Treaty, but also respecting agreements on conventional weapons, like, for instance, the Vienna document on transparency and risk reduction, or the Open Sky. Yeah.
Thank you very much. This concludes this roundtable.
Thank you.